I know this is not question and answer night. We'll have another one of those. I think it's November the next time. We'll have another question and answer night. So I know this is not question and answer night tonight, but I will answer one question, particularly for those of you who were here this morning. Yes, this is a different coat. And I appreciate the donations to have my other one dry cleaned and repaired. Celine said, "He's going to do that. He did it." Vacation Bible School, Fall Bible Fest, as we're thinking about it coming up. Many of you have already been doing some thinking and a little bit of work toward that. This Tuesday, we do have some things that we want to do as we prepare for that, and the several days prior to that. This is only about 10 days away. It'll be a little smaller scale and a little different than we are accustomed to about VBS this year, of course. But if, and it's been announced about, it's been put up here for service groups, various responsibilities for you to be involved in. And let me stress, this is not just on the shoulders of the service group leaders. We want everyone in each service group to take a part of this and to be involved in helping and putting this together that it might be as effective as possible. And you may have forgotten what service group you're in. If not, and if you have, there are lists, I think on the foyer in the board and maybe next to the office door there. You can check that and be involved in that and take part in the preparation for our Fall Bible Fest as we have that in just a few days away. Also, one thing that was told to me just right a few moments ago, Ms. Kathleen wanted to be sure that if you wanted to buy pecans through Agape to sign up tonight, it's $12, but sign up tonight because that list will be taken down tonight to be turned in. So if you need more information about that, talk to Ms. Kathleen, but sign up tonight if you were planning to do that. And also, this afternoon, as the elders were meeting, discussing various concerns that we have regarding our congregation, and as we think about the pandemic, and still thinking about how to handle so much of our reaction to that and what we should do about that. One of the great concerns we have is, of course, our worship, and we know we've had to adjust, we've had to adapt, we've had to do things differently than we have been accustomed to for a long time. One of the things, of course, that we all miss is our singing. We're not being able to sing nearly as many songs as we have been. As we talked about that a little bit today, we want to look at gradually phasing back in some more of our time for singing. And beginning tonight, we're going to double. We're going to add another song. And so after the invitation song, before the closing prayer, Carol will lead us in another song. So we'll have a couple of songs tonight. We'll do that on Sunday mornings as well. And for the next couple of 2 or 3 weeks anyway, we will go to a 2-song format. We're watching the numbers. Numbers are encouraging as far as cases are going down. As that continues to be the case, and we certainly hope that it is, we will phase in more and more like that. We are in unusual times, and we don't have a script to go by, and we're trying to do the best that we can, and we appreciate your patience and your understanding about it, and we hope that we're doing what is the best for our health physically, but most of all, we want to do what is best for our health spiritually. And we know that we teach and admonish one another when we sing. We encourage one another when we sing. And that is something that we have missed a great deal. But we hope as we are able to see this subside in the world, the virus subside in the world, that we will be able to continually add more back in as we are accustomed to encourage and admonish and teach and bless one another as we sing together and we praise our great God. Turn to Exodus chapter 20, if you will. We're going to look at some things that are from Exodus chapter 20, really chapter 19 and 20. And no doubt you're probably familiar when you heard Exodus 20. Most of us probably thought the 10 Commandments. And by the way, as you've sometimes maybe seen on a billboard, these are not the 10 suggestions. These are not things that Moses dreamed up on his own. These are not the 10 opinions. These are the 10 commandments. And as we think about that, we see that in the law of Moses in totality, according to those who've done the counting, there are 613 specific commandments. Thou shalt not. Well over 600. 613 is the number I have read from many different sources. And yet, we often talk about the 10 commandments. And really, when you look at these 10 commandments here, you're not just looking at specific commandments that stand alone, they do, but really what you're looking at here are 10 principles. God could have given thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of thou shalts and thou shalt nots. Thousands upon thousands of commandments. But with this list, God has given 10 principles that all the other commandments grow from. These principles that are here are the foundation for all under 603 laws in the law of Moses, all the other laws that we read about in the Word of God, all the other commandments we read about in the Word of God, all the other direction that God wants us to go. There is nothing really in the life of man, physically or spiritually, but particularly as we think about his spiritual relationship with God, there is nothing that is left out when you read this list of 10 principles. Every area, in one way or another, is covered. Everything and every responsibility and every obligation that man has to his Creator and to his fellow man, it's all right here. And then the specifics manifest themselves in various ways throughout the law of Moses and then later through the law of Christ. And indeed, as we look at this tonight, we want to approach this also from the standpoint of what's happening here when you back up one chapter to Exodus chapter 19. The children of Israel have left the Egyptian bondage. They have come to the foot of the Mount Sinai. God will soon descend there and He will begin delivering the law. Moses will go up there to receive it. And what you have here is the covenant, the agreement between God and His people being established. It was promised all the way back in the days of Abraham. It was promised during the lifetime of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and as it began to unfold until eventually you get to this point in time. And yet, as far as it being formally delivered to the people, this is where it happens. Exodus 19 and forward. In chapter 20 is where it kicks off with the specifics, the principles out of which the agreement will be guided by. The specifics will unfold themselves throughout the rest of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. They'll be repeated again in Deuteronomy for that next generation and recorded. And the covenant now is more or less formally presented to the people. And look at their reaction. Let's read a few verses in Exodus 19, and then we'll move into chapter 20 as we think about the covenant here. I have a book on Exodus, and I at the moment cannot, the author's name escapes me, but I think his last name is Smith. Yeah, right. But I think his last name really is Smith. But he takes this suggestion here for chapter 19 and 20 that I want to follow as we present this lesson tonight about the covenant, that the covenant here in chapter 19 is sealed, and in chapter 20 the commandments are revealed. So here's the sealing and the revealing. And in chapter 19, here's the sealing of the covenant, so to speak. Begin reading with me at verse 3 and following. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant," the agreement, that's what covenant means, it's an agreement, "then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people. For all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel." So Moses came and called for the elders of the people and said, and laid before them all the words which the Lord commanded him. Then, here's the reaction. God has said his part. He's communicated it to the people. Verse 8, "Then all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." The agreement is made. The covenant is sealed. God has said, "Here are the terms," and the people have said, "All that you have said, we will do." And so Moses, the last part of verse 8 says, brought back the words of the people to the Lord. Then, as we move into chapter 20, that's the sealing of the covenant, so to speak. The covenant is now sealed. We will do this. We agree. Beginning in chapter 20 and continuing through much of Exodus, in Leviticus, and in various parts of the book of Numbers, the terms are laid down. But it starts with these principles. The specifics and thou shalt and thou shalt nots are more delineated later. But right here, in chapter 20, here are the broad principles by which all these other laws will be founded. The broad principles under which this agreement will be struck, so to speak. These are the terms that God has said, this is what you said you're going to do. Now here's what it is. Because you notice chapter 20 begins, "And God spoke all these words, saying." And so now we have these principles. And as we think about this part of the lesson, the commandments here now are revealed. You have basically here a divine summary of everything that we need religiously and morally to exist in the right relationship with God. It's all right here, and the specifics will develop from there. But perhaps you are familiar and in your study and development and learning of this particular chapter and what's taught here, you also are familiar that these commandments, these principles, they speak of man's relationship, number one, to God, number two, to his fellow man. Commandments 1 through 4, that is man's duty to God. That's man's responsibility to God. Commandments 6 through 10, that's man's responsibility to his fellow man. Thousands of years, or at least many centuries, 1,500 plus years perhaps, after what we read in Exodus chapter 20, Jesus was asked a question about those 613 laws in Matthew chapter 22. He said, he was asked by a scribe, a lawyer, what is the greatest commandment? You remember Jesus' response. The greatest commandment is what? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second, which I don't think the guy even asked about the second, Jesus just sort of threw it in. And he said the second is likened to it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Notice what Jesus did when he said that. He said, love God, love your fellow man. The 10 commandments, the 10 principles tell us what? Our responsibilities to God and our responsibilities to our fellow man. In essence, with those two sentences, Jesus summed up everything we read here. You remember what he said? On these two laws hangs everything else. All the law, all the prophets. These are the coat hooks. I guess I could have used one of those this morning. Those are the coat hooks, in essence, that you hang everything on. Love God, love your neighbor. And that's what Exodus 20 says. It deals with our relationship with God and how we love Him, 1 through 4. And it deals with our relationship with our fellow man and how we love and treat him, 6 through 10. Now again, let me use the suggestion from a book I have on Exodus as to how we will break this down. We're going to look at duties to God and duties to man, duties to our fellow man. Responsibility to God, responsibility to our fellow man. And we're going to break those down with 4 words, 4 terms that will hopefully help us see what God intends for us to understand about the agreement that we have with Him, because we are not under the old law. We are not bound by the 10 commandments. 9 of the 10, though, are repeated in one form or another in the pages of the New Testament for us as children of God and Christians today. The only one that is not repeated is to keep the Sabbath day, but the principle there of dedicating a day to God is still in the pages of the New Testament. And so, as we think about this, even though we're not under the old law, we are under the law of God, which He says here, under the old agreement, the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, but the principles remain unchanged in the New Covenant, the New Agreement. The specifics are a little different. We're not bound by all the things that we read about in the rest of Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers, but the principles of what we are bound by are unchanged. And it's all right here. And so in principle, we are still under what we read here. And so as we break this down, let's think about the first 4 commandments. I just need to do that, I'm sorry. Our duties to God. Number 1, the supremacy of God. Commandment number 1. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. The Israelites had just come out of a very polytheistic environment. Many gods. And God says that He is to be supreme. This talks about the supremacy of God. A little later on in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, the Israelites will be told, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one God. Monotheism. One God. Have no other gods before me. Because after all, if God is God, that means He is infinite. That means He is eternal. That means He is sovereign. He is supreme. Now, how can a God who is infinite, eternal, sovereign, and supreme share His throne with anyone else? How could there possibly be another God like Him? Infinite, supreme, and sovereign. There is no room for another God. And so God says, have no other gods before me. And as you move and you think about the second commandment, it is related to this. All 4 of these are related to one another. We think about the similitude of God, because God says in verse 4, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, a graven image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water under the sea. You shall not bow down to them, nor shall you serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children of the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. And as we think about the first commandment is about the supremacy of God, this second one is about the similitude of God against idolatry. Do not create anything that is supposed to look like me. Do not make a graven image that is supposed to look like me. You know why? Because we have already learned from Genesis chapter 2 that God has made the representation of Himself. God has made the image of Himself. And who is it? Mankind. Let us make man in our image. There is no need to make something that we think looks like God. God has already done it. And so there is no need for us to be guilty of idolatry. Notice he says, not only should you not make the graven image, but you're making it for the purpose of what? Verse 5, bowing down to it, serving it. You think about idol worship, you think about pagan worship, it was unbiblical, it was immoral, it was really illogical. Oftentimes it was inhumane. They sacrificed children, to the god of Molech, we read later in the Old Testament. God says, do not bow yourself down to any of these. 1 John 5, verse 21, little children, keep yourselves from idols. There's no need for us to worship or be enamored with anything that is supposed to be in the similitude of God, because God has commanded against that, and God has already taken care of that. And notice that he says he's a jealous God. Now, the critics of the Bible would say that this is a negative thing. They would say, what kind of petty God does the Bible talk about when he says he's a jealous God? Well, you see, there's a such thing as righteous jealousy. Like spouses are for one another. Like parents are for their children. God has that righteous jealousy that He will not tolerate competition. Spouses should never tolerate competition. A husband should never tolerate competition for the affection and love of his wife. Parents should not tolerate competition for the love and affection of their own children. It's that kind of jealousy. That's the kind of jealousy that God has. So do not bow yourself down and become enamored with and love anything that is supposed to be in the similitude of God, because it simply does not exist on man-made level. Number 3, as we think about these first 4 of our duties to God, our responsibilities to God, there is the sacredness of God. The sacredness of God. Specifically, we think against profanity. Verse 7, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. The sacredness of God's name. The honor that God's name should have from His children, from His people. It's discouraging to hear God's name used in the vain ways, the terrible ways that it's used in our society, in public, on television, in movies. It's discouraging. God says His name is sacred. His name is holy. When Jesus was teaching us how to pray, in Matthew chapter 6, He said, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your name is sacred above all other names. No name can compare. And it is unfortunate that the name of God, that God Himself has become so disregarded as a serious father and being that it's difficult sometimes even to watch a show where there are contestants winning fabulous prizes and money, and they invoke the name of God at their disbelief of their good luck. It's discouraging. But the principle here is to honor the name of God. I am glad, though, to see sometimes, and this seems to be unique almost, but not exclusive, to athletic competitions, that athletes, after playing a wonderful game and winning and scoring many points and handling themselves so very deftly on their chosen field of competition, that so many of those athletes will come out and they will invoke the name of God in what I believe is an honorable way. And they'll say, let me first of all say, I want to thank my God, or I want to thank my Savior. I'm so glad for people like that. I'm so encouraged when I hear and see things like that. Honor the name of God. Don't use it flippantly. Number 4, service to God. There is supremacy to God. There is similitude of God. There is sacredness of God. And there's service of God and service to God. Honor the Sabbath day, or verse 8, remember, honor the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And it's kind of interesting as you think about it. There's more to say. God has basically more to say in Exodus 20 about the Sabbath day than anything else that He says. But the basic principle that we see here is that man ought to take one day out of every 7 and serve God. Man ought to take one day out of every 7, and that's a little less than 15%, by the way. Man ought to take one day out of every 7 to honor God. Under the old law, it was the Sabbath day, the 7th day, the last day of the week. We see that dramatically, overnight, basically changed in the pages of the New Testament when people came together, not on the Sabbath day, but what the New Testament designates as the first day. The first day of the week, the day Jesus rose from the grave, the day the church was established in Acts chapter 2. And the disciples, the Christians of the first century, and you and I continue by their example and by the teachings of the new covenant, the new commandment, to honor and remember the first day of the week. And this tells us about our service to God and how we ought to serve Him faithfully and effectively and as fully as we can. Now, let's change gears and let's think about Commandments 6 through 10, duties to man. Commandments 1 through 4, our duties to God, but Commandments 6 through 10, our duties to our fellow man. And as you think about that, we're going to use the same 4 words. There are more commandments here than 4, I know, but we're going to use the same 4 words as we develop this. So number 1, supremacy of man. And by that, we begin with the first commandment of our duties to our fellow man in verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land with which the Lord your God is giving you. That tells us a little bit about the supremacy of man and God's plan for the parent-child relationship, which is but a shadow of the parent-child relationship all of God's children have with God as our Father, that we honor Him. But there is a supremacy of our fellow man as we think about this from the standpoint that we honor and we pay the appropriate honor to our father and our mother, to those who have raised us, to those who have taught us, to those who have guided us, spiritually speaking, that we honor them in the appropriate way. And we think about that from the standpoint that when we honor our father and mother, we are honoring God, the Father of all mankind. And even if we do not have parents that are very honorable, Even if we do not have parents that we cannot spiritually honor, there's the great Father, spiritually speaking, God, that we can all honor. And that teaches us about how we treat, it's about the duty of man to man. But we learn from the duty of man to man about the sacredness of man, the special relationship that parents and children have with one another, the special relationship that men and women have with one another. And from that we learn about the special relationship we have with God, the Father. Secondly, we think about the similitude of man to God. Let us make man in our image, we have already pointed out from Genesis chapter 2. But notice the next commandment as you move down in Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. You shall not murder. Why not? Because man is made in the image of God. And murder, we learn from 1 John chapter 3 and 4, begins where? In the heart, in the mind. And when we hate our fellow man, we hate something made, we hate someone made in God's image. And in essence, we cannot be very far from hating God Himself. And so there is a similitude that we see in our being, in our person. And God says, do not destroy that. Honor human life. Because we are made in God's image, any attack on our fellow man is an attack on God. Any hatred toward our fellow man is a hatred toward God. And so there is a very important principle for us to remember in our duty to our fellow man, that we're made in the image of God, the similitude of God. Number 3, the sacredness of man. And of course, this is entirely different as we think about the sacredness of God. But our next commandment in verse 14 is, you shall not commit adultery. Sexual sin. You see, there is a sacredness in the human relationship that is intricately and intimately tied to our sexuality. And there's that special relationship that husband and wife have with one another. And that's not to be violated. That's not to be disregarded. And yet we know that we live in a world where adultery, fornication, immorality is rampant. It's glorified. And to be one that does not condone that, one who condemns that, is to be laughed at and to be scorned by so many in our society. So serious was the marital relationship under the old law, so serious was adultery and its violation of this principle under the old law, it was a capital crime. Could you imagine what would happen to our society if it still was? There is a sacredness in the human relationship with one another, especially of husband and wife. But you see, when the husband and wife relationship breaks down, when that sacred relationship begins to dissolve and to fall apart and is treated so flippantly, is just set aside as nothing that means anything, really, it's not that important, well, that begins to have a ripple effect on all the sacredness of all the relationships that you find in society. Till finally, no one is special and no one is sacred. No one has any special relationship with anyone. And as that sacredness of man goes down, proportionately speaking, immorality begins to drive upward and upward and upward and upward. And we see that in society right now, today. But that's our duty to man, our fellow man, to remember that sacred relationship, yes, between husband and wife, to honor that as husband and wife, but to honor it as a society, to honor it as all mankind. But now we come to the fourth one, and that's service. There is as we look at our duties to man, there is a supremacy of man, a similitude of man to God, a sacredness of man, but now a service of man to one another. And that would be summed up with the last three commandments. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet your neighbor's male servant, his maidservant, nor his ox or his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. And as we think about this being of service to God, in these last three commandments, I want you to fit it in this way. His property, his person, and his possessions. We have an obligation of service to our fellow man about his property. Thou shalt not steal. If it ain't yours, leave it alone. Don't take what doesn't belong to you. We have an obligation to our fellow man of service against theft. Do not steal. But we also have an obligation to our fellow man about his person, and that is about lying. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Well, we're talking about lying. We're talking about failing to honor the honest relationship that we should have with all mankind, because think about this for just a moment. Truth and honoring our promises. Truth and honoring our promises. That's the foundation of civil society, isn't it? And we see how it breaks down when people don't honor their promises, when people don't hold up to their end of the bargain, when people lie, when people are untruthful. And suddenly a great disservice is done to all fellow men and to the person of all people. Because we see how if there is no standard of truth, if there is no standard of keeping your word, of honoring your promises, everything's going to crumble in society, and the foundations will all fall. And so we have that service to our fellow man to be honest and honor him in his person and not being untruthful. And then finally, his possessions. We don't covet what other men have. We don't covet what other people have. And coveting, covetousness, as it's described in the New Testament, is where I want what you have. It's not necessarily even the point of I want one like what you have, but what? I'm jealous and I want what you have. I want yours. I want what belongs to you. I don't want one like it. I want yours because you don't deserve it. And so you see how that breaks down in our service to our fellow man. And possessions get people into all kinds of trouble. And the love of money get people into all kinds of trouble. What if we would just look at the principle here about coveting and avoiding it? That we would have a greater service to our fellow man based on his possessions, and possessions would not get in the way of our relationship and our duty to our fellow man, and ultimately our duty to God. Jesus summed it up again when he said that love God and love your neighbor as yourself. These words in Exodus 20 were spoken some 3,500 years ago. And they were spoken as the terms of the covenant. The covenant that in Exodus 19 the people said, all you have said, we will heed, we will hear, and we will do. We still are that special covenant people. Much of the same language that was used in Exodus chapter 19 was used by Peter in 1 Peter 2, verses 5 and 9, when he says that we're a royal priesthood, we're a chosen nation, we are a special possession of God's own people, and that we have obligations, and this relationship puts us under obligation to follow the greatest commands of obedience and continual faithfulness. Are you in that special relationship with God? Are you in that special agreement, that special covenant with God? To hear what He says, to believe it, and to obey it. And if we are we remaining steadfast, obedient, and faithful? It may be that you need to be restored. It may be that you need to obey the gospel. It may be that you are not in the relationship with God that you need to be in one way or the other. And you need to make it right. And you need to make your relationship with God sure and certain. If so, would you come